Hi everybody, welcome back. This is the 6th video in the series How to Compose, looking at GCSE and A-level music, and today we're going to be looking at structure and form with a particular focus on sonata form. So we're just going to jump straight into our new handout for the day. So let's share our screen. Okay, so sonata form, what is sonata form and how are we going to use it in our composition? Yeah, so Baroque composers tended to write long flowing melodies spun out using the same repeated rhythms, same ideas, the same instrumental color or timbre, and also the same tempi or the same speeds. This creates the same affection or the same mood, the same sort of atmosphere or character throughout the whole piece. And one of the famous examples I have here is from Bach's Brandenburg Concertos, number 5. In D major, and you can, if I zoom in a little, or quite a bit actually, because it's quite a small little picture, and as you can see, it's mostly comprised of semi-quavers and one or two quavers and dotted quavers, and even a quaver rest there. So our first phrase kind of ends on that quaver rest, and then the next phrase is quite long, as you can see. It'd be very difficult to sing this. And it tends to be like that throughout most of the piece. For the rest of the music, it's going to be the same sort of rhythms and ideas and speed, and there's not going to be a dramatic change in character or a sudden fortissimo chord into a completely unrelated key. You're not going to get anything that drastic in terms of changing the character of the piece. So classical composers, though, tended not to write their melodies like that. They tended to have much shorter, more memorable melodies with clear-cut, contrasting rhythms, instrumental timbre, and tunes that closely followed one another and constantly changing the mood, or the mood was changed every couple of phrases. There would be something new that was introduced. You can even see here from Mozart's piano sonata in C that we have a 2-bar phrase and another 2-bar phrase balancing that right afterwards. So balanced 2-bar phrases, and the rest will sort of indicate where does each phrase end and the next phrase begin, I suppose. That's a very famous piece, of course, from the classical repertoire, with the Alberti bass as well and the accompaniment. So comparing this rhythm, which uses crotchets, uses quavers, semi-quavers, dotted crotchets, minims, there's quite a lot of variety in rhythmic ideas here compared to the Bach above, which was mostly semi-quavers. So this was typical of a lot of classical composers when it came to their melodies. They tend to focus more on balance, form, and having a 2-bar or 4-bar phrase balanced by another 2-bar or 4-bar phrase. But the problem was, if you're having such short, memorable melodies like that, how do you actually build up the structure? How do you build up your piece from such a small collection of ideas? Sonata form was the way of doing this. It's a means of building up all these varying elements that we talked about: rhythm, texture, instrumental timbre, melodies, and building them up into a balanced, coherent musical design. So sonata form was used often in the first movements of nearly every type of instrumental music from the classical period onwards. It didn't last the entire Romantic period, the next period after the classical period, but it changed quite a bit depending on the composer using it. But throughout the classical period, it was very popular with Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven. And it was used in their sonatas, their symphonies, concertos, overtures, trios, quartets, basically anything involving instruments, even if it's just for piano or a large orchestral score. And because of that, of course, it also has the name first movement form. So sonata form is very popular, and it's actually going to be a really nice way of us building up our composition as well. So what makes up sonata form? What are the elements that make up sonata form? Most sonata form tends to have 2 main themes or subjects that are presented and developed over 3 sections. So you can probably think of the elements of binary 2-part and ternary 3-part form being combined here. Now, binary and ternary form They were used throughout the entire Baroque period, so there's nothing new there. But it's really how we're going to combine features from binary and ternary form together to create this larger form, sonata form. So the first section we're going to look at is the exposition. Now, in the exposition, the composer exposes or presents, states his or her musical material in two subjects. Now, the reason why we call it subjects is because subjects for later discussion, I suppose. And we actually are going to see these subjects again, and we're going to hear them being developed as well. And depending on the composer, these subjects could be made up of several smaller musical ideas. So a composer like Mozart, for example, may have a collection of maybe 2 or 3 musical ideas for his first subject, whereas somebody like Beethoven may only have one small motif. Like think of his famous Fifth Symphony, where you hear that quite a lot in the opening of the symphony for this first subject. So the first subject or the first group of ideas is always considered to be in the tonic key. So whatever your key that you decide to compose in, that's going to be your tonic or your home key, and your first subject should be in that key. It's often quite vigorous, rhythmic, very often triadic and bold. So we're going to use that to help us come up with our melodies for our first subject. Think of things that are going to be in our tonic key and quite triadic and quite strong. And it's followed by a bridge passage. And the bridge passage, if you're ever listening to a symphony or concerto or anything that's in sonata form, and you're wondering, okay, I'm hearing the first subject, but when do we start to get into the bridge passage? Usually that's the part in the music where there's a lot of fast rhythmical ideas going on, especially in the strings, maybe uses of semiquavers, scales, or repeated notes, or maybe leaping arpeggios or something. But it tends to be quite fast in terms of rhythm. It's considered like a busy section, fast busy section to get us to the second subject. So it's a bit more sort of transitional than a real melody as such. So the bridge passage is where we're going to modulate or change key to our new key for the second subject. And if you're wondering how to modulate or change key, there is the previous video I'd recommend watching before trying to modulate. The second subject or the second group of ideas is in your new key, but it has to be a related key, at least for classical music, and at least what we're going to be doing in our composition, we're going to have very closely related keys. At least in the exposition, we're going to have closely related keys. And you often go to the dominant. So if you're starting in a major key, the most common place to modulate to would be your dominant key. But if you're going to start in a minor key, which I think we might have a go at doing, we're going to be modulating to the relative major. Okay, so if it's a minor tonic for your first subject, go to the relative major for your second subject. In contrast as well to your first subject, the second subject tends to be more melodic, more scalic, or stepwise, more lyrical, maybe easier to sing or whistle. And it's actually followed by a repetition of the exposition so the listener can fully absorb both subjects as well. So you've got to remember, when a lot of this music was written, of course, there weren't any recording devices or any way of, going back over and easily listening to the music again. You may only get to hear some of these pieces several times in your entire life, unless you happen to be living in Vienna and being able to go and listen to Mozart concerts quite often. It has to be quite memorable, a lot of the melodies that are being written, and also to give the listener more opportunity to remember those melodies, you often repeat the exposition in sonata form. You go right back to the start and do everything again. First subject, bridge, and second subject. We're probably not going to do that in our composition just because we have a time limit. I'm going to set our time limit at 3 minutes, but depending on the exam board or depending on whether you're doing GCSE A level or whatever, you may have to check out how long does your composition have to be and what's sort of the maximum that they allow. And if you're composing something completely freely, of course, you can repeat that again if you like, repeat the exposition. So that's our first section, that's our exposition, where we get to hear the first and second subjects. In the second section, our development section, that's where the composer, of course, develops or explores the musical possibilities of any aspect of the ideas presented in the exposition. So usually a composer will take, several of the ideas from the first subject, the second subject, or even the bridge, and start developing those into different keys, maybe putting them in opposition to one another, depending on how many instruments you're writing for. Other instruments that may have been accompanying in the exposition now actually play the melody. So rhythmical, tuneful fragments will be repeated from any of the material in the exposition and brought through a variety of different keys. But you want to avoid the home key. So whatever key you decide to compose in, don't use that key in your development. Have it for your first subject, but don't use it in your development yet, because it is going to come back quite a lot in the next section. So for the development section, you often combine or set in opposition all the different ideas from the first section from your exposition. And that creates a feeling of sort of climax or tension or drama or conflict that needs to be sort of resolved. And it's going to be resolved in the next section, our final section, the recapitulation. The composer now recapitulates or repeats in a slightly different form the music of the exposition. So the first subject, first group of ideas, is brought back in your tonic home key, whatever key that is, and you have a bridge passage, but you may have to alter the bridge passage now so that you don't modulate. That's important to remember here. If you're going to be writing in strict sonata form, your second subject at this point needs to be in the tonic key. Okay, so in the exposition, it's in your either your dominant or your relative major, or another key if you prefer. Those tend to be the two most popular. If you start in major, goes to the dominant. If you start in a minor, goes to the relative major. So at this point, though, you want both subjects to be in your tonic key. And often the composer will round off the movement with a short coda section. We might do that as well, but it'll probably only be about 4 bars long. Just a lot of, perfect cadence, tonic, dominant, chords repeating back and forth, just to let the listener know that this is the end of the composition. This is the end of the piece. Okay, so if we put that into sort of table format, just to summarize everything there. This would be your exposition, your first subject, your bridge passage where we change key into the second subject, the second group of ideas, your development section where you have many new keys and ideas combined or set in opposition to each other in different instruments. Maybe you might invert ideas or treat them to sequencing or fragmentation and augmentation. All those ways of developing your melody, you can use them here as well. And in your recapitulation, again, your first subject in the tonic key, your bridge passage now altered so you don't modulate, and your second subject in the tonic key as well. And then a short coda section to round off. A really good example of this, guys, I would recommend listening to would be Mozart's Einen kleinen Nachtmusik, or Serenade number 13 for strings in G major. So depending on how long your piece is going to be, or maybe you're listening to sonata form, depending on the composer, the development section could be very, very different depending on the era, the composer, or if you're composing something, how much time do you have? Somebody like Mozart, his expositions tend to be quite large. He had so many musical ideas. He was known as a sort of a master composer of melody, even criticized a wee bit, I think, in his day for having too many melodies or too many beautiful ideas for the listener to remember. Of course, nowadays we can cope with that, being able to listen to his pieces as many times as we like. It's not as difficult to remember all those melodies. But somebody like Beethoven may only have a couple of melodies for his exposition, but he will develop them quite drastically, quite extensively in his development section. So something to watch out for. Compare symphonies from Mozart to, say, symphonies by Beethoven, and you'll get an idea of how different they can be in terms of structure. Okay, so if we were to take these ideas from sonata form and apply them to our composition, I'm going to open up a MuseScore file just to show you what we're going to be using. Okay, so this is MuseScore, where I've taken a MuseScore file, a blank MuseScore file. I'm going to be composing a string quartet, and I'm going to put it into the key of C minor. You, of course, can put it into any key, major or minor, whatever you prefer for your composition. And for our exposition, my first subject, I'm going to keep it 4 bars, remembering our video on how to compose a melody, 4 bars with another 4 bars. And I'm going to end the first 4-bar phrase with an imperfect cadence and keeping with the sort of style of sonata form, my first subject is going to be quite triadic, and it's going to be outlining chords 1, 4, and 5. So my tonic, subdominant, and dominant chords. Okay, so that'll be the sort of the first main melodic idea, and that's going to be balanced with another melodic idea underneath it, but this time ending in a perfect cadence. So my first 8 bars will be my first subject. I don't maybe want to have like a long introduction because, again, time. So time can be a critical factor when deciding how many sections you want to put in to your composition. So I'm just going to launch straight in to the first subject, no introduction. So if I zoom out a little and then go to the end of the piece, just to let you see how long is this going to be. And if I press, say, play here, at the top right corner, it's telling me that it's going to be 2 minutes and 53 seconds. I'm not sure if you guys can see that, but there is a little timer in the top right corner there. So I know that I want it to be under 3 minutes and, over 2.5 minutes, I suppose. So this is perfect then. So I've taken sonata form and put it as a template, I suppose, into this MuseScore file. Okay, so our bridge passage. Yeah, so our bridge passage is going to start in bar 9. Our bridge passage is where we have those fast animated rhythms, perhaps using semiquavers, maybe even using demi-semiquavers, depending on what our first subject's going to be. I don't know what our first subject is going to be at the moment, so I'm just going to leave that as semiquavers, but I might change it depending on how many semiquavers I'm using for my first subject. So my first subject could already be quite lively and animated and use quick rhythms, so my bridge was probably going to have to speed up if that's the case. My modulation towards the relative major. Yeah, because I'm beginning in a tonic minor, I'm going to be modulating to the relative major in my bridge passage. And of course, the whole idea of this passage is to propel the music forward into the relative major key. So I have to be coming up with quite fast rhythmic ideas for this. But I want to be ending in an imperfect cadence. I'm going to keep it roughly between 8 and 10 bars. It doesn't have to be balanced phrasing or anything. I'm probably going to be using a lot of repeated ideas and ascending sequences. So yeah, I'm just going to leave that a little bit open, I suppose. Between 8 and 10 bars long is long enough. I've already got an idea of my chord progression that I'm going to use. I'm going to have tonic and dominant for the original key of C minor. And then I'm going to use chord 6 in the key of C minor, which is going to be chord 4 in our relative major. So I know I'm going to go towards E flat major in this piece. So chord 4 in E flat major, that's your A flat chord. And that's chord 6 in the key of C minor. So A flat then will become chord 4 in the new key. Then I'm going to have my dominant chord or my chromatic chord, a couple of more predominant chords, maybe 6 to 4 to 2, then a nice cadential 6-4 at the end. So maybe 1 bar per chord. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, that would work. 9 bars long, I suppose. And then for my second subject, as we've seen in sonata form, your second subject tends to be more lyrical, stepwise, conjunct motion, or scalic as I've written here. And it's going to be in the new key of E flat major. And again, I want to end my first 4-bar phrase in this new key with an imperfect cadence, and my second 4-bar phrase with a perfect cadence. So if I zoom out a little, so the first 2 pages is just going to be my first subject, bridge, and my second subject. Okay, let's look at our next section, our development section. As you can see, I've left this quite open in terms of how many bars or how it's going to be structured. I don't really know. I've left quite a few bars just open there. Depending on the time limit of the piece, this could be a lot longer if you like, or shorter if you want to sort of reduce it to 2.5 minutes. So the development section is where we're going to take maybe the ideas from the first subject or the second subject or even the bridge and treat them to fragmentation, sequences, modulation, loads of different things you can do. We may be putting the first subject into the relative major or the parallel major. So it can either go into E flat major or C major. I just want to avoid C minor at all costs. That's the main thing. Or combine different parts of the first subject with different parts of the second subject happening simultaneously. Maybe the first and second violins are doing maybe parts of the first subject, and the viola and cello are doing something from the second subject at the same time. Or even put these combinations into various different keys. That's another thing we could do. We can treat all of it then to an ascending or descending sequence, or augmentation, diminution, imitation. So there's so many different ways of developing your melodies in terms of different keys and melodic development ideas. And if you're unsure of any of those terms, look at the video on melodic development that's part of this series as well. Or maybe give the main melodic ideas to the second violin or the viola, and especially the cello, because usually in a string quartet, the cello doesn't have as much to do melodically as, say, the first violin. So you may want to focus in on the lower instruments, the viola and the cello, in your development section. Just give them a little bit more attention, a little bit more focus. And then the recapitulation. So again, you just be taking everything, I suppose, from the exposition and copying it in here. Maybe wanting to change some of the accompaniment patterns in the viola, cello, or maybe the second violin, or swap over some of the melodies into different instruments. Again, with an imperfect cadence for those first 4 bars, and the second 4 bars going to end on a perfect cadence to make it sound nice and coherent, nice and balanced and complete. Yeah, the bridge, might change some of these chords. These are the chords I'm just thinking about. But again, animated rhythms, semi-quavers, but this time no modulation. Still want to maybe end it with an imperfect cadence, but we're going to be going into the second subject, now in the tonic key of C minor. So I may need to transpose things up and down. When I move everything from the exposition into the development, I might just be copying and pasting it in and then putting it into the new key. That might lead to some of those parts being too high or too low. So I might want to push them up an octave. So I've got to be aware of that you can't just copy paste entire sections from one part of the composition to another part of the composition without checking to make sure, is this actually going to sound good if you do that? Okay, and then that, again, imperfect cadence for those first 4 bars of that second subject, and a perfect cadence for the second 4 bars. And as I say, a little short coda, 4 bars long, tonic and dominant harmonies mostly for those last 4 bars. Yeah, so I always do that. As you can see, I've got the entire structure laid out there, ready to go. I'll probably want to look up and research a little bit more about string quartets to get an idea of what are good accompaniment patterns, what are good melodic ideas, how does the texture work, does the viola and the second violin, should they be doing a lot of things together, what is the traditional role of the cello. All of those things we're going to be looking at in the next video. So the next video will focus mostly on the textural ideas for the string quartet, and we'll probably just look at people like Haydn, Mozart and Beethoven and just copy their ideas for our composition, not their melodic ideas or their harmonic ideas, just the way that they use their instruments. We're going to probably adopt a lot of those features for our composition as well. Okay, well, hopefully that helped with sonata form. You may also want to consider composing in ternary form or maybe theme and variations. I will be making a video on all the different forms that are used in classical music as well, so keep an eye out for that. So binary form, ternary form, minuet and trio, theme and variations, ritornello form, there are loads. But we're only going to be looking at sonata form for our composition. So if you have any questions or any comments, leave them below in the video and I'll try to get back to them as soon as I can. And I'll see you again next time.